On March 17, 1982, an assistant social worker named Margaret Wilson visited an isolated cabin within Shannon County when Springsdale began to reveal the secrets of the harsh winter in the Ozark Hills of Missouri. What she found would forever change her understanding of the limits of social isolation and the consequences of institutional neglect in American rural communities. The Shelton property was 27 kilometers from the nearest city, Current River. Accessible only by a dirt road that, during spring rains, became impassable. The family lived virtually without contact with the exterior world for over 3 decades. Margaret's visit was motivated by an anonymous complaint received by the Missouri Department of Social Services claiming children were living in unhealthy conditions and possibly suffering abuse. Upon arriving at the property, Margaret was received by Elijah Shelton, 47, a man of median stature, gray beard, and intense blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of generations of isolation. Elijah lived in the cabin with his sister Martha Shelton, 43, and 3 children, Thomas, 12, Suddy, 9, and little Jacob, only 5 years. The cabin, a 2-bedroom, kitchen, and living room wooden structure built by Elijah's grandfather in the 1920s, also included a small barn, a vegetable garden, and a well. There was no piped water or electricity. Isolation was almost total, with occasional trips to the city to buy supplies they couldn't produce. The climate that day was mild, with a temperature of 17 degrees Celsius and partially cloudy skies. The recent defrost had left the ground around the cabin muddy, and the air carried the characteristic smell of decaying wood and wetland. During the initial inspection, Margaret noticed that the children showed signs of lack of basic medical care and light malnutrition. Thomas had a badly healed scar on his right arm, the result of an axe accident the previous year. Suddy had a slight strabismus that had never been treated. Jacob, the youngest, showed signs of delay in cognitive development for his age. What caught Margaret's attention, however, were the physical similarities between the 2 adults and the children. All shared striking features: the same intense blue eyes, the same facial bone structure, the same ear format, characteristics that suggested not only kinship but also a very close consanguinity. When asked about the children's mother, Elijah hesitated for a moment before answering that his wife had died during Jacob's delivery. Martha remained silent, avoiding eye contact with the social worker. It was in this moment Margaret began to suspect that the story made no sense. County records did not find any wedding certificate for Elijah Shelton. In fact, the only documents found were the birth certificates of Elijah and Martha, sons of Harold and Edith Shelton, and a land ownership record dated 1924. The children had no official birth certificates. The Shelton family was gradually isolated after the death of Elijah and Martha's parents in a fire in 1973. Since then, the siblings cut almost every bond with the local community, visiting the city only for basic needs. Residents of Current River described Elijah as a reserved and suspicious man who avoided prolonged interactions. The first suspicions that Martha could be the biological mother of the children began to form in Margaret's mind as she observed the family dynamics. The way Jacob clung to Martha's skirts, how intuitively she knew the needs of each child, and how her gaze revealed a deep maternal bond that went beyond that of an aunt. If you want to follow more cases like this which shake society as a whole and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. The formal investigation and troubling discoveries. The formal investigation of the Shelton case began on March 24, 1982, 1 week after Margaret Wilson's initial visit. The Missouri Department of Social Services, in conjunction with the Shannon County Sheriff, sent a team to evaluate the situation. The team consisted of Margaret, the policeman David Tanner, and pediatrician Dr. Robert Hayes. The first obstacle the team found was Elijah's resistance. When confronted with more direct questions about the children's origin, he put himself on the defensive, claiming that the authorities had no right to interfere with his family's life. "We take care of ours," he repeated, a phrase that later would reveal itself to be loaded with disturbing meaning. Martha, in turn, remained silent, responding only with monosyllables when directly questioned. The children demonstrated a mix of curiosity and fear in relation to the visitors, as settings showed their limited contact with people outside the family core. Dr. Hayes performed basic physical examinations on the children and observed several worrying signs. In addition to the lack of preventive medical care and mild malnutrition, he observed physical characteristics that could indicate genetic problems consistent with endogamy. Thomas had polydactyly, one more finger on his left hand. Suddy had dental development problems, and Jacob presented signs of cognitive impairment more severe than initially perceived. These signs, when observed in isolation, can have several causes, Dr. Hayes explained in his report, but when observed together, added to the family isolation and shared physical characteristics, they raised serious concerns about possible consanguinity. The investigation took a more accurate course when the team obtained access to the few medical records of the family. In 1970, Martha had been treated in a hospital in the neighboring county after a domestic accident. The doctor there had observed that she was 3 months pregnant. However, there was no record of birth or adoption of any child during this period. A deeper search in the records revealed a pattern. Martha had been treated in different hospitals in the region in 1970, 1973, and 1977, years that would correspond approximately to the ages of Thomas, Suddy, and Jacob. On each occasion, she used different names, but basic medical data and physical descriptions indicated that it was the same person. The investigation found a significant obstacle when Elijah, sensing the direction of events, prevented investigators from entering the property. Legally, without concrete evidence of abuse or severe neglect, the authorities had limited intervention options. It was at this moment that a crucial witness emerged. Sarah Jenkins, an 83-year-old woman who lived about 5 kilometers from the Shelton property, contacted Margaret after hearing rumors about the investigation. Sarah revealed that she was a friend of Edith, Elijah, and Martha's mother, and that she kept sporadic contact with the family even after their isolation. Edith was always afraid that something like this would happen, Sarah said. Harold kept the family isolated, saying that the world was corrupt and that they could only trust in their own blood. When they died in that fire, I tried to help the boys, but Elijah was already very similar to his father, suspicious, hostile. Sarah revealed that she had visited the cabin a few times after her parents' death, offering assistance and carrying supplies. In one of these visits in 1971, she noticed that Martha was visibly pregnant. When she questioned him about it, Elijah expelled her from the property and forbade her to return. I should have done something at that time, lamented Sarah, but who would have believed me? And where would these children end up? The system does not take good care of ours here. Sarah's testimony provided an important context, but it was not definitive proof. The investigation needed concrete evidence to intervene. A turnaround occurred when one of the agents revised the birth records of Elijah and Martha and discovered something intriguing. Their parents, Harold and Edith Shelton, shared the same surname before marriage. Subsequent investigations revealed that they were first cousins. It is not uncommon in isolated communities like this, explained the local historian consulted by the team. In the early decades of the 20th century, many families in mountainous regions lived so isolated that marriages between nearby relatives ended up happening for lack of options. In some cases, this became almost a family tradition justified by beliefs about the purity of the blood. This discovery shed new light on the case. It was not just a possible incestuous relationship between Elijah and Martha, but potentially a generational standard of endogamy that intensified throughout the generations. The team developed a new theory. Elijah and Martha's parents, already cousins, transmitted isolationist beliefs to their children. After the parents' death, the siblings, already socially isolated and possibly influenced by distorted ideas about family and purity, established an incestuous relationship that resulted in the birth of the 3 children. The investigation found an obstacle when a local resident claimed to have seen a different woman on the Shelton property in the early 1970s. This information briefly reinforced the theory that there could be a third person involved, perhaps an Elijah wife who later disappeared. Subsequent investigations, however, revealed that the witness probably had confused the date or the property. The sheriff, John Pearson, in relation to the allegations, began to consider obtaining a court order to collect DNA samples from the adults and children. However, the legal process would be complicated, especially considering the family's isolation and the lack of conclusive evidence of abuse or neglect that justified such an invasive intervention. "We have to act carefully here," the sheriff argued. "These people have lived like this for generations. For them, this is their normal way of life. If we invade the property without concrete evidence, we can lose any chance of helping these children. The investigation reached an impasse that would last several months. During that period, the Department of Social Services maintained regular visits to the property, monitoring the well-being of the children and gradually trying to build a relationship of trust with the family. The breakthrough and genetic evidence. The real turnaround in the Shelton case occurred in September 1982, 6 months after the investigation began. During one of her routine visits to the property, Margaret Wilson noticed that Jacob, the youngest, had a high fever and presented signs of a severe respiratory infection. Despite Elijah's initial resistance, she managed to convince him to allow the child to be taken to the hospital in West Plains, the nearest large city. At the hospital, Dr. Michael Brennan, a genetic specialist who had been consulted on the case, took the opportunity to perform more deepened examinations with the reluctant consent of Elijah, who accompanied his son. The results of Jacob's exams revealed multiple subtle congenital anomalies that individually they could have gone unnoticed, but together they formed a consistent pattern with a high degree of consanguinity. The genetic markers we are observing here, Dr. Brennan told the research team, are typical of children born in relationships between first-degree siblings. There is excessive homozygosis for a relationship between even first-degree cousins. During the 2 weeks of Jacob's hospitalization due to complications from pneumonia, Martha remained constantly by his side, demonstrating striking anxiety and maternal care. It was during this period that Martha, emotionally and physically exhausted, finally began to open up with Margaret. One night, while Jacob slept under the influence of medicines, Martha shared fragments of her story. She talked about the growing isolation after her parents' death, how Elijah gradually assumed the role of family patriarch, and how the limits between family roles began to be confused. "We didn't know anyone," Martha confessed in an almost inaudible whisper. "Elijah said the outside world wanted to hurt us, separate us. We could only trust each other." Although Martha did not explicitly admit to being the children's biological mother in this conversation, her words and emotions made the situation increasingly clear to Margaret. The social worker, taking extreme care not to break the fragile confidence that was being established, avoided asking direct questions about the paternity, focusing on offering emotional support. Meanwhile, the documentary investigation continued. A significant advance occurred when researchers located a traveling pastor, the Reverend Samuel Miller, who had visited isolated communities in the Ozark Hills during the 1960s and 1970s. Reverend Miller kept detailed daily visits, including observations on the families he found. In an entrance dated June 1969, he described a visit to the Shelton property. "I visited the Shelton family today. Their parents recently died in tragic circumstances, leaving 2 adult children, Elijah, 34, and Martha, 30. I found them living in extreme poverty and isolation. I offered material and spiritual assistance, but I was received with suspicion, especially by the young Elijah. Something in the dynamics between the siblings seemed disturbing to me. Martha looked submissive, almost fearful. I fear that without the moderating influence of their parents, as isolationists as they were, the situation can deteriorate. I intend to go back, but I confess that I was feeling powerless." A later entrance from April 1971 was even more revealing. "I returned to the Shelton property after almost 2 years. I was prevented from entering by Elijah, who seemed even more hostile and paranoid. From afar, I could briefly see Martha. She seemed to be in an advanced state of pregnancy. When I mentioned this to Elijah, suggesting that they might need medical attention, he was furious, accusing me of spreading lies and threatening to assault me if I did not leave immediately. I reported my concerns to the local sheriff, but they said that without concrete evidence of abuse, nothing could be done. These mountains keep their secrets, and I fear that some of them are too dark to support the light of day." Reverend Miller's diary provided the first contemporary evidence of Martha's pregnancy, corroborating the investigation's suspicions. Another crucial event occurred when the authorities managed to locate medical records from a Springfield hospital where Martha had been treated in 1977 under the name Mary Smith. The records confirmed that she had been hospitalized in advanced labor and given birth to a boy with multiple health complications, including a slight cardiac defect and breathing problems. The birth date coincided with Jacob's approximate age. The medical team at the time noticed concerns about possible genetic abnormalities and suggested more tests, but Mary Smith left the hospital against medical advice as soon as her condition and that of the baby stabilized. While Jacob recovered at the hospital, Dr. Brennan, with limited judicial authorization, performed additional examinations that revealed that the boy had a rare genetic condition called Apert syndrome, characterized by malformations of the skull, face, hands, and feet. This syndrome can occur spontaneously, but its incidence significantly increases in cases of close consanguinity. Based on the new evidence, Judge Eleanor Simmons issued a warrant authorizing DNA tests in all Shelton adults and children. The results obtained in November 1982 were conclusive. Elijah was the biological father and Martha, the biological mother of the 3 children. Leave a comment. Never give up on the truth if you believe all cases of family abuse deserve to be investigated, no matter how isolated the community. Trial, sentencing, and aftermath. On December 7, 1982, based on genetic evidence and collected testimonials, Elijah Shelton was formally accused of incest, a Class D crime in Missouri, punishable with up to 4 years in prison. Martha, considered a victim due to evidence of prolonged psychological coercion, did not face criminal accusations, but her ability to take care of the children was questioned in court. Elijah Shelton's trial began in February 1983 and attracted significant regional media attention despite efforts to keep the case relatively discreet and protect the children's privacy. The Shannon County Court hosted one of the most complex and morally challenging cases in its history. During the trial, Elijah's defense, led by public defender Joel Thompson, argued that the extreme isolation and the dysfunctional environment in which he had been raised had compromised his ability to discern basic social and moral norms. Thompson presented evidence that Harold and Edith Shelton, Elijah and Martha's parents, had deliberately isolated their children, depriving them of formal education and normal social contact. The defendant, Thompson argued, is the product of generations of isolation and possibly from previous endogamy. He himself is the son of first cousins who raised him believing that the outside world was hostile and that the family should remain introspective. The prosecution, represented by Amanda Lewis, recognized the attenuating circumstances but maintained that Elijah understood the nature of his actions. The defendant demonstrated the ability to interact with the community when necessary, to conduct basic business, and deliberately hide the true nature of his relationship with his sister, Lewis argued. These are not the actions of someone unable to distinguish right from wrong. Martha Shelton witnessed behind closed doors. Edited excerpts from her testimony, subsequently disclosed, revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation that began after her parents' death when she was 29 and Elijah 33. According to Martha, Elijah gradually assumed full control over all aspects of their lives, isolating her more and more and convincing her that the outside world represented a threat to her safety and the family unit. "He told us we were special," Martha said. "That our blood was pure, that our children would be strong because they would not be contaminated by the world outside. At first I resisted, but after years alone with him, I started to believe." Dr. Richard Foster, a psychiatrist specializing in social isolation and abusive family dynamics, witnessed as an expert, explaining to the jury the deep effects of prolonged indoctrination and extreme isolation. "What we see here is a classic case of an alternative reality built by isolation. When one person is systematically excluded from all normative social references, their perception of what is acceptable can be radically distorted." The trial also highlighted the failure of local institutions to identify and intervene in the situation. Evidence revealed that concerns were expressed by at least 3 different people over the years: the Reverend Miller, the neighbor Sarah Jenkins, and an employee of the Current River Supply store, who noticed similarities between the adults and children who occasionally visited the store. In none of these cases was there a proper follow-up by the authorities, revealing systemic failures in monitoring isolated communities and in the protection of vulnerable people in remote rural areas. After 2 weeks of testimonials, the jury considered Elijah Shelton guilty of incest, but recommended clemency due to attenuating circumstances. Judge Eleanor Simmons sentenced him to 3 years in prison with the possibility of conditional freedom after 18 months, and ordered compulsory psychological treatment. In her final statement, Judge Simmons noted, "This case represents a collective failure, not just of the defendant, who is still responsible for his actions, but of a society that allows entire families to be set aside by our support and protection systems." Geographical isolation should not mean institutional abandonment. As for the children, the court ordered them to remain temporarily under state custody while Martha received intensive psychological treatment. The ultimate goal was family reunification, since Martha showed the capacity to properly care for the children and keep them integrated into the general community. The children were placed in a foster home in the neighboring county where they began to receive formal education and medical treatment for their various conditions. Thomas, the eldest, demonstrated remarkable adaptability and resilience, rapidly catching up with his colleagues in educational terms. Despite the initial delay, Suddy had more difficulties with social adaptation, but responded well to treatment for her strabismus and other health problems. Jacob, the youngest and most severely affected by genetic disorders, underwent several surgeries to correct malformations and started intensive care for his development delay. Comprehensive genetic tests revealed that all 3 children were carriers of multiple genetic anomalies resulting from endogamy. Thomas presented mainly minor problems such as polydactyly, which had already been surgically corrected, and a predisposition to certain autoimmune diseases. Suddy presented more significant problems, including a rare enzymatic deficiency that affected her metabolism and required continuous medication. Jacob, as previously identified, suffered from Apert syndrome, among other complications that would require medical care for a lifetime. The Shelton case triggered significant changes in social service policies in Missouri and neighboring states. The Shelton Law, approved by the State Legislative Assembly in 1985, established more rigorous protocols for the monitoring of families in isolated areas, including regular visits of social workers and wellness checks for all children regardless of formal complaints. Elijah Shelton fulfilled 22 months of his sentence before being released on conditional freedom in 1985. As a condition for his liberation, he was prohibited from returning to the family property while the children were under Martha's care and had to undergo continuous therapy and regular supervision. Martha, after 2 years of intensive care, recovered the children's guardianship in 1984. With state assistance, she moved to a small house on the outskirts of West Plains where the children were able to continue their medical treatment and studies. She completed her own GED, the high school equivalent diploma, and finally got a job as a library assistant in a local library. The history of the Shelton family continued to evolve in the following decades. Thomas, the eldest son, surpassed the adversities of his upbringing and graduated in social service, dedicating his career to help children in situations of vulnerability. Suddy faced more difficulties, fighting chronic health problems and psychological challenges related to her past, but she ended up finding stability as an artisan and artist. Jacob, despite his physical and cognitive limitations, conquered a semi-independent life with community support and became a defender of the rights of people with disabilities in rural areas. The Shelton case remains an iconic study in law and social work faculties across the country, illustrating the complex intersections between geographic isolation, rural poverty, dysfunctional family dynamics, and institutional failures. It also highlights the physical and psychological effects of endogamy not just on the children directly affected but also on subsequent generations. In 2002, 20 years after the initial discovery, Margaret Wilson, then retired, reflected on the case in an interview with a local newspaper. "What's most impressive looking back," she said, "is how something so extreme could happen practically in plain sight of everyone. It wasn't a cabin in the middle of nowhere, it was less than 30 kilometers from a city in a country with institutions and resources allegedly capable of protecting the vulnerable. It makes us think how many other similar cases exist, hidden in remote valleys or in plain view of all, hoping someone pays attention." Shelton's original property, abandoned for years, was eventually sold by the state in 1990. The cabin collapsed over time, but the land remains a silent reminder of how extreme isolation can distort realities and perpetuate cycles of damage for generations. If you have watched here, it is because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here so that I can know who really cares about the search for the truth." Do not forget to enjoy this video and share it with those who also value the understanding of the complexities of human nature and the importance of effective protection systems. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now to follow more investigations of cases that make us reflect on our society and collective responsibility.